Okay, as we get started here in this main room breakout session, I'm Nancy Beers. I'll be your moderator for this program. I'm the president of the Virginia Native Plant Society, so I have quite an interest in native plants here. For one thing, we'd like everybody to stay muted. I think you've been muted as you stayed in this room, so stay on mute. Put your questions in the chat box if you would, and we will field them at the end of the program. Also, this is being recorded, so it will be visible. I mean, it will be posted or sent to you all later. So another thing that I found very helpful when I watch Zoom sessions is if a screen comes up that has a lot of information that I'd like to jot down, I usually hit my little print screen button so that I get a screen print of it, and that's very helpful to me later on. Is everyone ready to go? I think we have 161 participants in the room. So that's a very good indication of interest here. So I will introduce our speaker today. We're very pleased to have Elisa Meara. She is president of Native Plant Landscape Design Corporation, a Falls Church, Virginia landscape design firm specializing in the ecologically friendly use of native plants. Elisa was born in the Dominican Republic. In 1997, she immigrated to the United States. From 2000 to 2010, Elisa accompanied her foreign service husband and their 2 children to 3 different posts in Europe, Azores Island in Portugal, also London and Rome. While in the Azores, she became fascinated with the diverse fauna of that archipelago. While in London, she completed an intense program in garden design at the world-famous Inchbald School of Design. In Rome, she completed an internship with a major garden firm and began her career as a professional garden designer. Returning to Northern Virginia in 2010, Elisa created Native Plant Landscape Design, which has helped hundreds of homeowners create native plant gardens that are ecologically sustainable and that support all elements of the ecosystem. Elisa frequently speaks to garden clubs in the Washington metro area. She's received prestigious awards from both Fairfax County and from the Commonwealth of Virginia. Please welcome Elisa Meara. Take it away, Elisa.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that introduction. I must say it was written by my husband. So let me share my presentation and let me know that you can see it.
Yes, it's
okay, great. So I am very, very happy to be here. Thank you so much, Nancy, for inviting me. The only thing that I'm regretting is that we cannot be in the same room, which, you know, I love to, you know, share information and interact with people. But, you know, hopefully next year we're going to be able to go back to do these kind of things. So as Nancy mentioned, I worked for Native Plant Landscape Design. We are based in Falls Church, and our work is designing and creating gardens that are sustainable, right? Gardens that for the most part are composed of native plants. I'm going to do the first part of the presentation. I will focus on the site assessment, and my colleague, Alex Thompson, will talk about the design process. That will be a presentation at 11 o'clock in 1 hour. Okay. So site assessment, assessing the conditions of your yard is maybe the most important step you can do before you plan a garden. And the better you assess it goes directly in direct relation with the success of the garden. I am a trained landscape designer, but my #1 passion is gardening, right? So I can relate to many of you when you go to a garden center and you discover this new beautiful plant and you bring this plant, you know, to your garden, and you think you have the perfect spot for this plant, and then this is what happens, right? You know, after a few weeks or after a few months, the plant start wilting, it turns brown, or maybe it gets too big for the space and it looks so little in the nursery, and you have to start pruning it 3 times a year, right? That is very common. So all the plants that we see in a garden center, in their real life, they are plants that come from a natural habitat. Even what we consider indoor plants, they live happily outdoor somewhere in the Caribbean or somewhere in a tropical forest in South America. Sometimes this is hard to believe. This is a picture that was taken in the Bay of Samaná in the Dominican Republic in one of our vacation home about 2 years ago. So the winning formula when you are planning your garden is to assess the conditions very carefully, right? And then try and match the needs of the plants to the conditions that you have in your garden. You have to look at the conditions, and you have to match the conditions to what kind of natural habitat it resembles the most, right? So remember that also, there are different kind of plant habitats, and we're going to talk a little bit about the different kind of plant habitats that we can find in our areas. But plants are also somehow flexible. They are not very rigid. Like, for example, plants that live in a woodland, they can tolerate maybe a little bit of sun, or maybe plants that can tolerate dry conditions can also live in moist conditions. And in nature, there are many regions that are also transitional regions, right? The area, for example, in between a woodland garden and a meadow garden. And these natural areas of transitions are called ecotones. So, and many of our native plants are adapted to live in these ecotones. So when you are also planning and you are trying to match your conditions with the conditions of a natural habitat that you think it resembles, just be flexible, right? Just know that plants are flexible too. This is a garden that we installed about maybe 2.5 years ago. It is a wonderful client that had a new construction in Lorton, Virginia, and most of the perennials in this garden were plug size. So they were about maybe 2 inches or 3 inches tall. And these pictures were taken just last fall. So you can see how fast these plants have evolved, because they were actually happy in those conditions. Habitats and different communities. So I'm going to simplify it, and I'm going to talk just about 3 different habitats that we can find in our area. That is before we go into the site assessment part of the presentation. So the first habitat, actually, sorry, the first habitat that we're going to talk is the meadow habitat. It is a habitat that is, for the most part, open. It has, it's very exposed to sun, so it has full sun. It is composed mostly by grasses and herbaceous. And in this habitat, in our area, for the most part, doesn't occur naturally. They need to be maintained artificially, either by mowing or sometimes by fire, right? Within the meadow habitat, you can have meadows that are very well drained, so are mostly composed by soils that are dry or maybe moist, but with soils that are very well drained. Or you can have meadows that have soils that don't drain very well. So these are meadows that have wet meadows, they are called. The second habitat that I want to mention, sorry, I'm a little distracted because this slide is not working the way it usually works. But anyways, the second habitat that I want to talk about is the edge of the woodland or the edge of the forest. In this habitat, usually we get well-drained soils and we get light shade and sometimes full shade. The woodland edge habitat is usually the habitat that we, the kind of habitat that we encounter.
Not in the right room. I can't move them.
Oh, sorry. Anyways, the edge of the woodland habitat is the habitat that we usually encounter more often when we go and visit clients. Many of our projects back to a natural area. Not only that, because also the existing conditions in residential landscapes, either in urban or suburban areas, the conditions, that you have like partial shade, existing structure that would give shade, like fences and tall walls. These habitats resemble the habitat of an edge of the woodland habitat. Let me see if it works. If you, like, for example, happen to live in a yard that backs to a natural area, or if your yard has many existing plants that you can identify as native plants, you could possibly see what kind of habitat naturally grows in your neighborhood. And you can find out what kind of plant community is happy in the habitat and try to just get plants from that plant community. And that would be a way to make sure that your plants are going to be happy. And we're going to talk about this in more detail. I know it could be a little bit confusing. The other habitat that we are going to talk about is the riparian habitat, which is a community that usually places that are close to the water's edge. This habitat is composed by plant communities that stabilize banks, and they do that by slowing the stormwater runoff. Usually in this habitat, the water drains very slowly. It might be close to, to the canopy of existing mature trees. And for the most part, it's a habitat that has partial sun or partial shade. And obviously the soils are wet or very moist. So let's start talking a little bit about how to assess the conditions of your sort of residential yard. There is a formula that we all learn in training while we are in training, which says the right plant in the right place. And I always say that there are not people that have green thumbs. There are just gardeners that get to know the conditions of their yard very intimately and match those conditions with the plant needs. It's kind of tricky to assess the conditions of a residential yard because unlike open natural areas, the conditions of a residential yard sometimes is limited by structures, by fences, by downspouts that drain in a particular area, and so on. For example, you can see here how you have a tall, wall of the house and you have a fence. And even though the area beyond the fence might be full sun and it might be an area that is south facing, you just have to take into consideration the shadow that is cast by this existing structure. Or, for example, you could have an area that is south-facing, but then you have a very mature oak tree. So even though that area right in front of it, so that area that faces south, even though you can, think that is an area that will be full sun, you have this, tree that casts the shadow and has a lot of root competition. Oops, sorry. Another thing that we take into consideration is new constructions or houses that have had a renovation done. Usually in these kind of conditions, we find that we have very compacted soils, and sometimes we have a lot of debris and things. So if you just move to a newly built, is something that you have to take into consideration. Then before you start planning your garden, these are the questions that you can start thinking about. We usually do this in the first meeting that we have with our clients. We walk the property and we try to get every corner of the property, of the yard as well as we can. The time that we invest in getting to know the site will directly correlate on how successful and how happy the garden will be. So one of the first questions that I ask, and one of the first things that I have to pay attention is invasive plants. I would say in our area is the #1 problem that we have. And it is quite a problem, right? So before you start thinking about going to the nursery and adding native plant, walk your yard. Maybe you can use one of those apps that can ID plants and try to identify all of these invasive. The invasive plant problem is so severe in our area that it's starting to change the ecology of some of our natural areas. And the worst part of this problem is that these plants for the most part come from our residential gardens. I always say this is we are usually flexible when we get the briefing from our clients about their style and what they want to have in their garden. But this is an issue that I have no compassion or any, flexibility. And I will encourage you, if you have any invasive plant that you can identify, remove them today or tomorrow, and we need to stop buying them. I assure you that there is an alternative native plant that can do exactly the same thing that your invasive does. Many people have these plants and they don't know. So as I say, try to identify if it's an invasive plant. Here I am just mentioning a few. We could spend pretty much the whole day talking about them. Butterfly bush is a popular one, and people sometimes tell me, oh, but it attracts so many butterflies. No, but it's one of the worst invasive. Mahonia nandina domestica, which is so popular as well. Not only Nandina domestica has shown to be invasive, but the berries of the Nandina domestica have a chemical called cyanide that can actually poison birds. Barberry, Rosa multiflora, English ivy, vinca, Japanese steel grass. Sometimes the problem of the invasive plant is so severe that before we try and think about a design or an installation, we recommend our clients to consult with a professional invasive control company. There are resources that you can find for free in the internet. For example, this booklet from the National Park Services and this other booklet from the United States Department of Agriculture. So the second thing that we look at is how much light the area that you are planting gets. And what I mean, how much sunlight it gets, you have to take into consideration, for example, that the sunlight that you get in the morning is not the same sunlight that you get in the afternoon, right? So the client can tell me, oh, I get about, 4 hours of sunlight, but this sunlight is from 8 o'clock in the morning until noon, right? So it's not the same a planting bed that gets morning sunlight of a planting bed that gets the sunlight from like 2 o'clock in the afternoon to 6 o'clock in the afternoon. Another thing that we encounter that is very common is people that tell us, oh, I have an area that is very dark, it's very shaded, and I don't know what to plant. So let me tell you, I have good news for you. We have a wide range of native, and many of them live very happily in areas that are heavy wooded, therefore are adapted to, for example, be planted in front of a wall that is north facing, and they would do very happy. And native plants that are for shade or, edge of the woodland or woodland combinations are very beautiful. They are very green. They have a lot of texture. And usually for the most part, they flower in the early spring. So that's something to take into consideration. Also, when you are assessing the yards, as I mentioned before, look at the structure. This is a project. This was when I was doing the assessment. This is a house in McLean. Our client's house is the house to the right. And if you see the orientation, like for example, my client's house, that is the house with the gray wall, it was west facing. So this was the afternoon. So the planting bed that we were doing adjacent to that wall would get afternoon sun. But if I were to be designing a planting plan on the neighbor's side, it would be a planting combination for shade conditions. So you can see in an area that is so close how you would have to do two completely different combinations of plants from very different plant communities, if that makes sense. The other important thing to take into consideration, obviously, is the moisture of your soil in your property. Walk every little bit of your garden. Take note or where you have standing water. Take note of areas that are very dry. Usually the areas that are upland tend to be drier, and the areas that are downland are, are more moist as well. There are things that can affect the moisture of the garden. For example, there are existing structures, sometimes retaining walls. Sometimes there are change in the grading within a yard that, don't allow the water to move freely. I mentioned compaction is another one. There are things that you could do to improve the soil permeability before you do the planting. Something like air spade or adding organic materials. There are other factors that sometimes are a little more difficult to identify, like for example, this picture I took in one of our clients' yard in Alexandria, Virginia. And what happened here, the water just came from the water table that, is an area that the water table in that area is very much in the surface. So we had a few weeks of a lot of rain. So all the water was coming from below. So we couldn't, we didn't know why the plants were dying, some of the plants. And then I had one of the guys just dig a hole, and this is what we discover. A trick that we sometimes do before we want to select a planting combination is a percolation test. And a percolation test is something very easy that you could do, which means you just dig a hole in the ground, which is maybe a foot or a foot and a half in depth, and you fill it with water. And then you observe it, and you see how fast or how slow the water percolates, and that will tell you a lot about your site. This is usually something that we do when we are planning a rain garden. Or like, for example, when we are planning a sponge garden, and a sponge garden is just an area that, that we plan to have a conservation landscape to receive the water from, the extension of downspouts or the water that comes from higher areas of the property. Another thing that you have to take in consideration is the water that comes from your neighbor's property. That is another thing, like maybe 60% of the time or 70% of the time of yards that I find that, have a problem with flooding or water that doesn't move. The water comes from the neighbor's downspout, or the neighbor's property is higher in elevation, and so on. So things to think about. Okay, let's see. The other thing that we look at is the characteristics of the soil. What is the content of clay? What is the pH? In certain ways, when we are doing obviously a professional design, we recommend the clients to have a soil test done. It's a very easy thing to have done. There are many companies that do it for a very low fee. You can also have a soil test done through your master gardeners organization, right? In general, I must say, working with native plants, we, for the most part, we are very successful just trying to find a community that grows naturally in the area without having to do a soil test, although a soil test can tell you a lot about your soils. There are some native plants that prefer certain kind of pH, like for example, the mountain laurel, the rhododendrons, the azaleas, they love a little lower pH. Or for example, the green and gold tends to like a little bit of a more alkaline, so sometimes it's helpful. Or if you're planning a vegetable garden, it's important to also know the pH or the nutrients level, and then you can adjust that. But for native, to plant native, we never change the composition of the soils, because that would be working against what we want to do. There is a website, is the Web Soil Survey, which I recommend. In this website, you can type your address, and there are certain steps that you can go through, and they have all the explanations of the steps that you how you do it, but you get a lot of information without having to do a soil test. Like for example, this I just did yesterday to show you, and where you see that 104C, that is my house, and what that tells me is that my soil category is the 104C, and on the right, you can see all of the different characteristics of my soil. I know for a beginner, all of these different kind of things could be a little confusing, but there is a lot of information out there in the internet, and it's a way for you to learn a lot about your site. Another thing when you're walking your yard is take into consideration the slopes. We have somebody from the company that does the initial survey for us, and we usually ask him to let us know where the beginning of the slope is and where the end of the slope is. The plant palette that we use for an area that is leveled is not the same plant palette that we use for a sloped. We have a problem in this area, which is that many of our clients try to grow turf or lawn in areas that are very sloped, or in areas that are sloped and are very shaded. So naturally, the lawn doesn't do very well, and it has a very shallow root system. So what happens is that soon the turf or the sod fails, and you get a lot of stormwater runoff, and you get a lot of erosion. So every year they lose, maybe half an inch of topsoil. So these areas, for the most part, we do the cleaning. We usually use a biodegradable fabric that is made out of coconut fabric called jute netting before we do the planting to hold the ground, and then we choose native plants that have a very deep root system. And, just if something that you want to remember, sedges, for example, which are cold season grasses, or for example, if you have a slope that faces south and it has full sun, you can use warm season grasses as well. They have a very deep root system. But here in this illustration, you can see how the non-native plants have a very shallow root system, and how some of the native plants have a very deep root system. Now, a word of caution: not every native plant have a very deep root system. So do your homework. And the picture to the left is kind of a screenshot of my worst nightmare because you have a deer with a background of English ivy. And wildlife is another one of the considerations that we have to take before we plan our garden. If your yard is exposed to a lot of deer or to a lot of rabbit, you're gonna try to choose plants that are less susceptible to be browsed by deer. I must say, when the deer is very hungry, they can pretty much eat anything, but they are less likely to eat sedges, they are less likely to eat ferns, they are less likely to eat grasses or plants that have a certain smell, that the leaf have texture of, that are thorny, like the plants from the mint family, the pycnanthemum, or things like that. Rabbits can be also a big problem. For example, we do a lot of projects in Arlington County, and we find that in Arlington County, maybe we don't, in areas that are very urban, maybe we don't have a lot of deer, but we do have a lot of rabbits. There are also a lot of organic treatments that you can find in garden centers or online that are very effective. Not only you have to look down and at your soil and at the wildlife, but you need to look up and look at your power lines, right? Or some of the utility lines in some of our neighborhoods. You have the cable going above. You want to make sure that the plants or the trees that you plant on their utility or power lines, eventually, when they get to be a mature tree, they won't interfere. So you won't have to have the power company trim them every year. So that's something very, very, very important. And that's something that we see very often. Another consideration is septic systems. If your residence is not connected to just to the public septic system and you have an independent septic system, you need to make sure that you know the location, not only of the tank, but also of the drain field. There are restrictions of plants that you can plant around for example, the drain field. You cannot use, or within 10 feet of the drain field. You cannot use trees or shrubs that are very large, or you cannot, we recommend not to use plants that have a very deep root system. Because they can interfere and they can go into the pipes, and it's better to do a little bit of homework rather than having to pay for very expensive repairs. Windows, the windows of your house. When you're taking into consideration the plants that you're planting close to windows, you have to, for example, is this a tree or a shrub that is very dense? Will it block the light coming into my dining room? Or it could be the opposite. It could be that you're planting a tree or a shrub to block a street that is very busy, or maybe to give you some privacy from the neighbor's backyard. And that not only goes for windows, but that also goes for certain areas of your garden that you are planting. Many gardens or many planting beds are not only, planned to have a beautiful garden, but they are also functional, right? Not only we are doing something for wildlife to be pretty, but we are doing something because we need some privacy, because that is the patio or the deck where we gather. Well, I don't know if we are gathering too much now, but hopefully we will start gathering again next year. But anyways, another thing to think about is hardscapes and impermeable surfaces, for example, driveways and sidewalks. You have to take into consideration the heat that reflects from sidewalks. You have to take into consideration the runoff water that you get from these impermeable surfaces. Also, for example, people walk their dogs on sidewalks. So you have to choose plants that are very resilient. You have to choose plants that have a very deep root system. Another thing that happens in these areas is you have to do a snow treatment. For example, if you have to, do salt in the winter to deal with the ice or with the snow, you need to make sure that the plants that you do in these areas are okay with having salt, drain in the winter time. You have to think about the inhabitants who live with you. Do you have young children? Do you have pets? And full disclosure, this is my golden retriever that I just lost a few months ago, so I miss him terribly. But anyways, he had a very long, happy life, and he was like a permanent feature in my garden. And you need to think about plants that can be toxic for pets. For example, the mountain laurel, some of the milkweeds, although the milkweed is an amazing plant and I am not discouraging you from using it, but if you have small children, you have to teach them not to touch the plant or not to put the berries or not to eat the berries from certain plants. Also, when you're planning your garden, think about how your dogs move. Like very often we have to leave a gap in between fence and planting because the dogs needs to run around, you know, on the side of the fence, barking at the neighbor's dog. Or sometimes, now thinking about it, we have to leave what we call the mailman path, which is like sometimes mailmans, they move from front yard to front yard. So we have to think about leaving an open space to move. Think about the use that you're going to give the garden, and based on that, plan the shape of your planting bed. And let me see how we are with time. Many of us live in properties that are part of a resource protection area, right? A resource protection area, they are just vegetated areas along water bodies, things like lakes, as rivers, as streams. These are environmentally sensitive land. There are regulations that you have to know before you think about developing these areas. Usually the counties, in their website, they have maps that you can access to. And if you suspect, because you have a creek or a river or a body of water close by, that you can see which areas of your yard belong to a resource protection area. Sometimes you cannot clear the existing vegetation. You need a permit for that. Or for example, if you in the case of Fairfax County, I believe if you have a planting bed that you want to develop that is more than 3,500 square feet, you have to do it by area. So you have to, remove the invasive plant, mulch, and then move on. The other thing to take into consideration is HOAs, regulations of HOAs. Sometimes you cannot have a vegetable garden in the front yard. Sometimes they don't want very large trees. Sometimes you need to leave some lawn, and hopefully these things are changing and there is a little bit more flexibility. There is this wonderful booklet that Earth Sangha is a wonderful nursery based in Springfield, Virginia. And with this booklet, what they have done, if they have divided plants by different conditions, right? They explain the different habitats and they give you a combination of plants for every condition. That could be very helpful. After you assess the conditions of your yard, you can go and you can see what plants grow in those conditions in this brochure, and then you can match the conditions with the plants. If you want to know, for example, how high or how wide this plant is going to get, how many you are going to need, this is a brochure that is wonderful for beginners. I find myself using it still very often, and it will tell you also the kind of soil, the kind of moisture that certain plant species require. Native plants for Northern Virginia from the organization Plant Nova Native is another wonderful resource. Their website also has a lot of interesting things. All of these resources are for free in the website. You also have the digital atlas of the Virginia flora, which also can tell you which specific native plants are native to your neighborhood. So this is another great resource. This is an app also that I use very often. I have it in my phone, and also tells you a lot of information about what specific ecotypes. So just to conclude this presentation, we do this and we go beyond, because obviously we do this to a professional level. don't let all of this information discourage you. Know that when you bring native plants, you will bring butterflies, you will bring bees, you will bring birds and all sort of beautiful things. These kind of gardens will give you a lot of satisfaction. This is the two views that I have from my studio. The first one is when I look to my back, the window to the back, and the other one is my window to the left. And I cannot tell you, when I am working and I just stand up and look back, and it's just so relaxing and so wonderful. Go for them. I wish you the best, good luck, and happy gardening. And I think we have a few minutes in case any of you have any questions. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Elisa. That was very informative and very thorough as to all these different conditions we need to look at. Let's see, we have a few questions in here. One person asked about what kind of organic treatment do you recommend for rabbits?
There is, first of all, when you are doing your planting combination, think about the plants that you're going to choose, right? As I mentioned before, sages, plants like the pycnanthemum, which are the local mints, are less likely to be eaten by rabbits. Also, like for example, we know Sisyrinchium agustifolium, or blue-eye grass that grows in the sun, and ferns. These kind of plants are, tend to be left alone. There is an organic product that we use and we recommend. We don't have anything to do with this company, but we have found that it is very effective. It is called Deer and Rabbit Out, and we usually get it from, online from Amazon. And what we do is we spray the garden, especially when it's a garden that is newly installed. We spray it every 2 weeks or so, just to teach the rabbits or the deer that this is not an edible garden. And we have found that it is very, very effective.
Elisa, can you tell us the difference between the afternoon sun and the morning sun?
Right. So the morning sun is, let's say, a lot weaker than the afternoon sun. The morning, usually in morning sun, we are still able to plant a planting combination for woodlands, like, for example, many ferns and many plants like the Jacob's ladder or the green and gold, or for example, the Pachera aurea. They can live happily in full sun and in morning sun. The afternoon sun is the strongest sun, and is the, when we get at least 5 hours of afternoon sun is what we consider an area of full sun. 4 to 6 hours of afternoon sun, you can go with plants that are within the meadow community, which are warm season grasses, some of the milkweeds, the coreopsis, and things like that. I hope that makes it clear.
Well, thank you. Yes. Is there anything you can do if your neighbor is redirecting their water into your yard?
Yes. So the first thing is I would recommend to have really good relations with the neighbors, have open communication. And I always say, when you have a situation in your garden, like let's say a water problem, usually the problem is not one thing, right? Usually the problem is a combination of problems, right? Not only you have a compacted soils, but you get the, the neighbors' water, and, you have a new development that just happened a block from your house, and they took down 50 mature 4 beautiful oaks. And now all the water that used to percolate in that area comes running down, right? So I always say, until we all change and we all start looking at our yards as part of the major ecosystem, there won't be a 100% solution, right? But let's say you don't talk to your neighbors and you don't know who they are or whatever. Probably you can identify the area where exactly the water comes from. And then in that area, you can maybe do an infiltration trench. And maybe in front of the infiltration trench, you can have a sponge garden, which is pretty much, as I mentioned before, a conservation landscape that is designed to receive a lot of water. And then the planting palette that you put there are plants that are going to be super happy in those conditions, like the Asclepia incarnata, which is this picture. You can see the happy bee there, or I don't know, the hibiscus. We have a beautiful hibiscus mosquitoes that takes a lot of water, or some of our rushes like the Juncus effusus, right? Or sometimes we do berms, right? And a berm is just a little, I don't know how to explain it without, like a little mountain. Just, you shape the ground and you do a little, sort of a little berm, what a berm is. And what the berm does is to redirect the water, right? And sometimes we put many different berms and we do overflow in the berms. Or you could consider a rain garden as well. And a rain garden, if you have the right conditions, if you have a soil that percolates well, that rain garden could be not only to receive the water from your downspouts, but also to receive the water from your neighbor's yard and your neighbor's downspout. But you need to, try and do the right calculations and the right test before you commit to a rain garden. And everything is online. You have a lot of information online to make you do these systems and make them successful. I cannot hear you, Nancy. You're muted.
Excuse me. Somebody's asked, is the only option for high groundwater to regrade and add soil?
For a underwater, that is for a water table?
For high grade.
For high
groundwater, high groundwater.
No. When you are talking about regrading and when you are talking about adding soil, you are talking about modifying the existing conditions. And that's what we don't want to do. We have to assess the conditions. We have to learn the conditions that we have. And then we have to find plants that are happy in those conditions. And we can only add, planting of those conditions in that area. That is the formula for success. And that's what we do professionally. The old-fashioned way of trying to fix and trying to bring lots of organic material and try to add fertilizers and try to use chemical, that is old-fashioned, that is gone, and we have to move forward. You have to assess your conditions, you have to learn your conditions. And an advantage that the homeowner has is that the homeowner is there all the time. So you could possibly take a whole year to study your condition. Take pictures, take notes, learn what happened everywhere. This is an advantage that you have that we don't have. Usually we have 1 or 2 meetings before we have to go into design mode. So again, learn your conditions, match the plants to those conditions.
Okay, just a few more minutes. Somebody wanted a suggestion for a tree that would serve as a screen in a wet, shady area up to 50 or 60 feet tall, equally wide.
Well, maybe you can consider a birch tree. The Betula nigra it's a tree that is native to our area. It can certainly get to be, I think, 60 feet or something like that. It has a gorgeous bark. I have one in my rain garden. It has this beautiful papery bark. Sometimes you can get that tree that is, it has multiple trunks. Sometimes it's a single trunk. And it's a lovely feature. It is actually a deciduous tree, so it will lose its leaves in the winter time. So you won't have the privacy in the winter, but in the growing season, it's beautiful and the bark is just stunning. There is also the wax myrtle or Morella cerifera. If you have at least partial sun, it is an evergreen and native shrub, and it produces these beautiful light blueberries that birds love. And that's one that we've been using quite often, especially when we have at least, 3 or 4 hours of sun. There is also the Viburnum nudum that takes water, but that's more of a shrub. But it can get to be maybe 15, 16 feet tall.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Do you have any more suggestions on a rain garden about what size somebody would need to be effective?
Right. So this is nothing that we could do, in a 30-second answer. I believe Fairfax County has a booklet on rain gardens. I mean, it's not rocket science, but you do need to make your calculations. Not only you need to know the kind of soil that you have and the permeability of the soil, but you have to calculate, for example, the size of impermeable surfaces that will drain into that rain garden, the size of semi-permeable surfaces, and roughly do calculation of the different depth of the rain garden, because the rain garden has different depth, right? It has gravel, it has river rocks, it has engineered soil, and then you do your planting, and then you do your mulch. So I would suggest, I think Anne Arundel County in Maryland has a wonderful online booklet on rain gardens that, is a wonderful resource.
Just about out of time now. I want to thank you for a wonderful presentation. Thank you for all your questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to them. Perhaps we can get back to you by email if we have your email.
And I think at the end I'll be available at the very end.
Oh, she is going to be available.
Noon, yeah.
And you see Elisa's email address there, info@nativeplantld.com. So thank you again very much.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
So for those of you in this session, it'll be a 5-minute break, and you don't have to do anything. And then I'm going to do my best to set up the second sessions, hopefully in a different way, so that everybody can pick their own room a little bit more easily. So we'll start